All right, so we'll just jump in. All right, today we are going to be discussing 3 picture books by Katie Yamasaki, and our discussion leader is our esteemed community member, Frances Kai-Hwa Wang. And let me just give you a little bit of background info about her and her amazing, illustrious career. So she is a journalist, essayist, speaker, activist, and poet focused on issues of diversity, race, and culture, and the arts. So she has a few projects going right now. One is called Beyond Vincent Chin, Legacies in Art and Activism, which is funded by the Night Arts Challenge Detroit. She has a book of poetry that is coming out through Wayne State University Press, currently called Breath Rising. She's starting a new column about writing with the New York Writers Workshop. And she also is working on a book manuscript right now that is about talking to children about racism. And she just won an award today with Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. So welcome so much, Frances. Thank you for being here. And if you could just start us off with a little bit of an introduction about why you chose these books for us to talk about today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I love the Ann Arbor District Library. My children and I practically grew up at the library. We're big fans of Miss Laura. Yes, everyone in town is, I know. And I wanted to, I wanted to talk about, one of my favorite authors. I mean, there are a lot of favorite authors, so it's hard to talk, but I've interviewed and written a lot about Katie Yamasaki. Oh, you can't see it, there's a glare. See, Ann Arbor District Library. But I wanted to talk, I've written about her for New York, NBC Asian American. I've written about her for Our Detroit. So I've talked to her several times, and I just love her work and what she's doing as an artist. And she's local, so you can go, to Detroit and you can see her work, and as well as in the library. So where do we begin? So actually, let me tell you about how I met her, because that's always a more interesting story. I'm a journalist. So I was at the Arab American National Museum covering an event. There was a Japanese American theater group that was performing, and I was there to cover that performance. And I was talking to the people in the cast, and some lady in the audience overheard that I said I was a journalist. So this is a good story about why you should, if you have an important project, make sure all your relatives know. So this lady overheard I was a journalist, and she comes running up to me and she said, "You have to do a story on Katie Yamasaki. She just has this book. It's just been approved by, it's called Fish for Jimmy. It's just been approved by McGraw-Hill readers. It's going to go into actually, I don't remember how much detail she gave me, but I recognized the name Yamasaki because Katie comes from a famous family. And I knew instantly, I knew the name, but I didn't really know anything about Katie Yamasaki. And this lady would not leave. She made me write it down. So I got it right. And she stayed with me a while. And so later I found out she was a family friend and a big fan of, she watched Katie grow up, and thanks to her, I, found out about Katie's work and started researching and interviewing her and doing some stories about her. And so Katie is the granddaughter of Minoru Yamasaki, who's a famous architect. He designed One Woodward Avenue in Detroit, and he designed the World Trade Center. And when he lived in the, in Michigan, right after World War II, he wasn't allowed. He was like one of the biggest architects in Detroit, and he wasn't allowed to buy a house in Detroit. And so he lived way up in Troy, and his old offices are still there, I think. But anyway, so famous architect, very important for Detroit and Michigan history. And Katie is his granddaughter. And so she grew up in Lake Orion, and kind of came of age in the 80s during the auto recession. And it's a car factory town. She dealt with a lot of anti-Asian American discrimination. And what she says, actually, let's put it, I don't want to put a negative spin on it. She was fairly protected because she has a famous grandfather and a white mother. And that protected her in school. But one of the searing memories that she has was in 7th grade on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. Her 7th grade teacher said to her, "So Katie, would you like to tell the class what happened on this day in history?" And she's just a 7th grader, and but she's smart. And so she didn't take the bait. And she said, "Yes, December 7th was the day that my grandfather was arrested by the FBI and incarcerated." And she's told the story of the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And the teacher said, "No, that never happened," and shut down the conversation. And I mean, this, you know, and she never learned anything about Japanese Americans ever again in school. And so, so when she, you know, grew up, she became an illustrator and a muralist and a picture book artist. And one of her first books was Fish for Jimmy, which told a family story about her uncle, who, when they were incarcerated at the Grenada War Relocation Center in Colorado, one of the brothers, there are 2 brothers, and the younger one was sickly. You know, they were little, they didn't really understand what was, you know, what this was about. But the older brother would sneak out of camp at night. You know, you have to sneak out through barbed wire fences, but he'd sneak out at night and go fishing. And he caught some fish and he brought it back and gave it to the younger brother. And it's a beautiful book. It's just delightful. It has images of you know, the little brother sleeping on the backs of fish. It's just beautifully done. And a few years ago, it was chosen to go into the McGraw-Hill Readers. So not only does it exist as this beautiful picture book, it is going into the reader. So every 4th grader in America will read this story in 4th grade and know about it. And also know, well, no, you know, you learn a couple of things. First, you learn about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, which is not taught enough in our schools. But you learn about it in 4th grade. You're old enough to learn something like that. But it also tells them that this is something that happened to children like them, right? Or people like us, just regular everyday people. And it also shows children that you're not, there's something you can do. Right? If an injustice occurs, there's something you can do to help your brothers and sisters. And I think that's very natural for children to want to help their brothers and sisters. And so anyways, that's how I first met Katie Yamasaki and learned about her book. What else do we want to know about Katie? So that was my introduction to Katie. And I was like, wow. And then I interviewed her and I learned about her murals. So she's a very talented muralist. And she's done murals in like over 80 murals around the world. And so, let me see, I've got one here. And so she's done some in Detroit. You can kind of see this. This is at the Bog School in Detroit. Here's another one. This one, this is not the best way to show you the pictures. So this is Trayvon Martin. It says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And it's right on 94 and Gratiot. So if you come off the highway, there it is. And it's on the back of On the Rise Bakery, which is a bakery run by, I think, I forget. Anyways, it's a bakery. I think it's run by, I want to say, a religion, anyways. It's a famous bakery, and it's a bakery that helps formerly incarcerated people who are returning citizens learn a skill and work in a bakery, and they make great bread, right? And so you go there, you see the mural, you smell bread everywhere, and that's her next book that she's working on. So there's a lot of books in between, but like her next book that's coming out is called Dad Bakes. And it's about a returning citizen who bakes at night but then comes home in the morning and spends the day with his young daughter and gets to know her. And so her, so that's kind of the beginning and the end of let's see. So what else is there? So other books that she's done. So that's a little bit about her murals. And her murals, again, social justice themes, a lot of themes about women and children and formerly incarcerated people. And they're just beautiful. In New York, she has a mural where she works with a group of mothers who are incarcerated, and then their children who are outside. And so she works with both groups. And so she gets ideas and she guides them into making a mural together. So even though the mothers and children are separated by incarceration, they're able to make this beautiful piece of art together. And they draw and they painted, and she oversees that project. And so I think all of her murals have this, actually you see a lot of this in her most recent book, Everything Naomi Loved. And this is a story about a young girl who's dealing with gentrification. She loves her neighborhood, but the neighborhood is changing. And as things leave and as they disappear, she's sad. And so she learns to paint them, and she paints them on a wall. She makes a beautiful mural so that she can remember all the things that she loves. And so gentrification is a big, difficult subject. How do you talk to children about it? Well, children are living it. So that's kind of the wrong, I don't know if that's, I wouldn't say wrong question, but there's another way of looking at it. Children are living through this. So it's not that this isn't something you shouldn't discuss with children. This is something children are dealing with. And so, that she talks about how, all this terrible things can be happening and you can be sad about this, but then a dog walks by and licks your leg and you think that's hysterical, or you're painting and you're having fun painting and you don't have to feel guilty for that. And it's just this mix of emotions that happens. And so that's what her book, one of her books that talks about that. And then I guess one more book. This is actually my favorite book, When the Cousins Came. And this is about two sets of cousins who come together. So Katie grew up in a big, racially diverse family. They had lots of people and lots of cousins. And I come from a really big family, lots of cousins as well. So I love this book. But in the book, you have two sets of cousins. They're city cousins and country cousins, right? And they're also culturally different. They're racially a little bit different, but they have similarities, right? And I think age is a little bit different. And so this is what happens when you have a lot of cousins. And so there's some things that you learn from each other. There's some things that you're afraid of with each other. And it really is a beautiful story about how they come together and learn from each other and the things that they're frightened of and that they come up, it's full of surprises. And in her art, you'll see there all these little flourishes, these little butterflies that are everywhere. And these butterflies follow the children through the whole book. And it's just lovely. And so anyways, that was what else would you like to do you want?
Well, so I guess I just, thank you so much for that introduction to Katie Yamasaki and the books. And wow, I mean, just that story that you told about her being in 7th grade and her teacher asking that question and her just completely flipping the assumptions behind that question on its head. I mean, and I think that in itself really illustrates the necessity and the power of storytelling and telling different stories. But yeah, I mean, I just, if you want to choose one of the books, and we can just jump in with any of them, and if there are any topics or themes that we want to discuss in them. I mean, they're all really, really rich books. I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, I don't know how to do this.
So I guess, I mean, I think maybe we can go back to Everything Naomi Loved, which was that book was really striking for me, and kind of along the lines of what you were talking about, Frances. And I wondered if other people had any thoughts about this, but when I first read the book, I was kind of expecting that, because you see a lot of, I don't know about a ton, right? And I'm also not a youth librarian, so this is not my specialty area, but I think there are a lot of books that like encourage children to activism, or encourage children to see themselves, as you said, as agents of change, and that I think might take some more, maybe more traditional views of that. So what I'm saying is that, so we have this problem of gentrification that's being discussed in this book, that's being introduced to these young readers. And in a way, I was kind of expecting for Naomi to be like, take up a bullhorn and start leading some protests and things like that. Because I've seen other children's books that kind of go there and encourage that kind of action in children. And I was very interested in how the book framed the problem of gentrification, and also the way that, like Naomi's role in responding to it. So I wondered if anybody else had any thoughts about just what you thought about how the book was doing that.
I think one really interesting thing about that book, where Naomi sort of gets to be an activist, is in she's choosing to tell a story. And I think it sort of answers the question of like, how does a community record its history? And so much of history is in who tells the story. It reminds me of what you were saying about Katie, and that the teacher saying what happened on December 7th, and she just flips it. And so I think that, like, by taking a hand in creating these murals, that's recording the community's history, whether or not the community is shrinking or changing. Naomi is giving a voice to the community, and I think that's a way to be an activist.
Mm-hmm. And I did really love, actually, with all three of her books, I loved the intense point of view of the child and them seeing all of these big important things happening in the world around them, and how it impacts them, or how they're managing it on a day. Like, the book starts with Naomi, and she wakes up, and it wasn't pretty, but it was alive. It was her street, and she loved that street. And the book does go, it's pretty fast paced as far as all of the changes happening. But just watching those little changes and how she's absorbing them, it's just, and for me too, I really love the part where she said that we're at the end where they're drawing the mural on the thing, and then she ends up there looking out the window, and Mr. Ray says, that's the view I've seen over the past 8 years. That's part of my street. And she herself never thought of herself as being part of it. I thought that was really cool for her to realize that, yeah, I'm part of this community too, just like my best friend and Mr. Ray and all in the tree and the other pieces on her street. And I also love that it's just her street, because when you're a kid looking out the window, that's your world. You probably can't go behind or beyond point A and point B. So that was her world. So I just really love that it was such a poignant point of view of this small girl, and like her small view, and seeing what was happening to it.
This was my favorite of the three books. I really enjoyed this one a lot. And, when we read books, I think we usually relate it to our own lives. And I took this book to be a lot about accepting change. Change is constantly going on, and it made me feel better about when I visit old neighborhoods where I used to live. Things are different. They may be gentrified. They may just have new people living on the streets. It's constantly happening. And I felt a sense of acceptance that change is all around us. But yet she was able to capture one snapshot of what it was like to grow up on that street in a particular window of time. So I really enjoyed it.
It also just like let her be a kid, because I had a similar reaction as Emily, where I was kind of expecting maybe like her to pick up the bullhorn or like some big community fight, but like this seemed a lot more realistic to the experience of a kid, where you are a kid, you're a child, and your street's changing, and kind of like making peace with that and carrying your memories on as you move. It felt very realistic, and like it had a lot of emotional weight too. Like it was sad. It made me sad.
I think going back to what Lucy was saying about how art, even if it's not intended to be an activist activity, sometimes it often becomes that way, especially public murals. And in this case, the public murals, they kept making new ones because the buildings they were painting on were getting torn down. And I think that is a realistic thing that happens in communities, like with art and other fixtures. So I think that's an important thing. Like, and then in the end, she takes the little brick with her that has a little piece of the mural. So it kind of was showing like you keep the story alive by telling it.
Mm-hmm. And I think on the back of the book, the author said that she was inspired by that happening to one of her own murals. The building was being torn down, and people in the community started saving little pieces of it. So I thought that was a great way to also accept some of the change, but take this piece of beauty with you and keep it alive in some form.
Mm-hmm. And Amanda, to your original point, to what I really liked about, sorry, my street is very loud. What I really liked about both this, and especially when the cousins came, these two books felt similar to me in this way. I tried to imagine myself as a child reading them, and I felt like they offered a lot of space for a child not feeling pressured to feel any sort of way, to be able to recognize maybe their own reactions in the book, looking at their own street or experience, but also offering space for interpretations as a child, because there wasn't, directive, like you were saying, and Marissa, you as well, which I really thought that was great about this. I loved that.
Yeah, and then about what you guys are saying about how you expected there to be, the protest kind of activism. I think there are many paths, right? Not everyone is that kind of a protester, but that doesn't mean that's the only way. So that's a lot of again, the beauty of this book. It shows other ways of doing it, and yeah.
Knowing that Katie also creates social justice-based murals, I feel like that kind of brings it full circle. Like, it's not explicitly said in the book, but I feel like it kind of opens that door. Like, art can lead to more, and art can create a community space, especially public murals.
Yeah, and she has her most recent mural is absolutely gorgeous. It's at the Novo Foundation, NOVO Foundation in Brooklyn, in New York City. And it's, so I think it's like 4 stories high, but you have these beautiful pictures of women and children like wrapped around the building. And then there's these long walkways where you have people, above you and below you, all around you, and walking down these walkways. And they're just gorgeous. Her work. And gorgeous and accessible, right? Just absolutely accessible. And like what Elizabeth was saying about space, right? Creating space so you can have your own interpretation and your own room to move. Because if anyone's tried to write a children's book, that is the hardest part, because you cannot preach to children. Children are very smart. You cannot preach to them. And so giving them that space to have that, that interpretation, and giving them something to do, right? what did they say? All children, I mean, what did they say? I think Julia Cameron says this, all people are natural artists. And we see this as children, we're all natural artists. Children create this amazing art that we all stick up on our wall and on our refrigerators. But then sometime as an adult, we become afraid of it or embarrassed by it and say, oh, I'm not an artist or I can't draw, right? Children never say that. And so anyways, this is kind of accessing them.
Speaking of children doing art, there was one part in the story where they were working on the mural. I think it was at the tree part, and she was asked, "Do you want to help?" And she said she was afraid she was going to mess it up. Mm-hmm. But then shortly after, when her friend moves away, that's a big jolt to her system. And then she said, and she's sitting next to it with her scooter, and she got the chalk out, and at that point she was ready to put her mark on that wall, and she drew her friend's scooter, and then Ray came along and helped her. But I did at first she was like, I don't want to mess it up. This is really great. And then she's like, no, my voice needs heard. I need to be in there. Even though she only starts with the chalk, I thought that was a really good moment for her to just get to the next level, emotionally.
Yeah. And Mr. Ray beats her and invites her in, right? And helps her kind of find her voice in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, just listening to you talk about murals, about Katie Yamasaki's murals. And by the way, I watched a little video of her. If you just search for Everything Naomi Loved, there's a video of her talking about making the book. And it's she actually takes these pieces of canvas that, I don't know, they're maybe 3 feet by 2 feet or something like that on the wall. And then she paints them. So it's like every page is like a mini mural, which is she didn't say it that way, but I was like, but that's what you're doing. It's like every page is a mini mural. But yeah, just the idea that a mural or that creating art is not just about memorializing the things that we've lost, but it's also about creating the world that we want to see. And that just made me think of that when you're describing her most recent project, Frances. It's this way that people can actually visualize as a community what they still want, what they're looking for in the future. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you say that, Emily, about the how she created the book. Because I was thinking, here she's painting. Frances, you're talking about this 4-story mural, and that's a big in scope. And then we have these beautiful picture books with these tiny details, like the butterflies and when the cousins come, or Everything Naomi Loved has those scrolls with the musical notes going through it. And I'm thinking, what an amazing ability to be able to paint on such a huge scale, but then also to do such small detail. So it's interesting to hear that she does it in sort of the same way, but in a different scale.
Yeah, when I learned, before I met her, I didn't know anything about murals, right? But to see her pictures of her painting the murals, right? You need a heavy equipment, right, to get people, lifts to get you up, or sometimes people are standing on top of bands to get the height. So you need height, you need a hard hat, there's all sorts of technical skill involved that, it's obvious once you stop a minute to think about it. But before I'm not that kind of an artist. So with visual art, I'm afraid of to make any claims or say anything about visual art, but yeah. And then these workshops that she does, she doesn't tell a community, this is what you should paint. She asks them, what do you want to paint? And what do you want to draw? And she leads them through the storytelling process of doing that. And I had no idea that's how people did murals before, right?
And again, that seems like such that perspective of, I'm not going to tell you what to paint. It's almost like she brings that kind of wisdom to her picture books, because yes, she's creating the book, but like that, as Elizabeth was saying, like, I'm not going to tell you what to think, or I'm not going to tell you what to feel. I'm just going to put this here. And, you know, and just leaving kids to interpret it. So I want to move on to another one of her books, which is when the cousins came, is just a really sweet. It's just a sweet little book, and you know, and I think that one of the threads I also see in her work is in these three books is I guess maybe I would call it like trying to figure out where you fit in the world, or maybe like, you know, you kind of like a child getting the sense that like, oh, maybe that there are parts of this world that aren't meant for me. So I'm thinking here about like Everything Naomi Loved, when you see this luxury condo or whatever it is going up, and you see these posters that are saying like, ooh, luxury living, convenience, and stuff like that. And it's, you know, it's very clear that this is not directed to Naomi's family and neighbors, right? But she's sort of living in the midst of that. And I think that when the cousins came is exploring that theme kind of like on a more intimate scale, where you're like, here are people who I love, but also I'm not sure if I'm part of their world or if they're part of mine. So I guess I had a question. Sorry, my question was like right there, and then it just flew out of my head. Just fine. I know what I wanted to ask. So on one hand, I think she's dealing with like this very age-old theme, right? Which is kind of like city mouse, country mouse. Like we see, like, right, this is something that kind of shows up in kids' books a lot. But I guess I just wanted to ask you all what you felt that she brought to it with the characters and the activities they're doing. How did she take that theme that's familiar and do something unique with it?
Well, the book starts. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the book starts out where she's the big sister. She's got a little baby in the house, and she's so excited for the big kids to come because the big kids will be big like her and they will play like her. But then they get there, and there's subtle differences that she's picking up. Like their hair is different. They have skateboards instead of bikes. There's just little things where she's like, oh, wait a minute. It just becomes a different experience than she was expecting. So I just like that. That's her entrance into like figuring out like what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was like a really universal theme because I mean, we experience that even as adults, right? Even if it's not like city versus country, we experience things where we have an expectation, or maybe we're really excited about something. And then we realize, oh, this is not quite the way I anticipated this going, or this isn't exactly who I thought this person was going to be. And I thought that Katie Yamasaki did express that so gracefully in this book. I kept worrying that it was going to escalate and maybe like the book was going to be about like bullying, or maybe about like when things don't go well, how do we like, you know, we were really excited about this, but, you know, it didn't go well and that's okay. And we don't get along with everyone. And I was so delighted that that's not how it ended up, that it was about groups of people, or in this case, the two cousins and then the one cousin, adjusting expectations and making like subtle changes throughout the book to relate to each other. And I was just like thrilled by that theme because I thought it was so universal. So I was just delighted by that.
It was interesting too, like the fears they had were so different. And by the end of the book, they kind of conquered those fears with each other. I definitely had the same reaction as you, Elizabeth, when it seemed like they were laughing and kind of like, oh, they're not going to talk to me. But then they come and they leave her that really sweet note. So yeah, so someone who suffers social anxiety, I feel like that moment I was like, oh, they're it's going to be awful. But no, they all come together and fight their fears and differences. And it's just a really sweet ending.
I like that.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, I also like that it ended on a hopeful note. Mm-hmm. And I think that it really differs from, the more traditional tellings because it's so not cutesy. It really is. I find it to be such an adult story. You meet someone, your expectations are so high, you might be a little disappointed. The other person is a little different than you idealize them to be, and vice versa. And you work it out. And ideally, it's nice when you end on a happy, hopeful note of growing a relationship together. And so I really enjoyed it. As many of you have said, it has a lot of adult themes in it.
Yeah, I think that this book also, what I really love about it is that it very gracefully talks about the complexities of race, because both sets of cousins are multiracial, but they're multiracial in different combinations, so to speak. And so I actually gave this as a Christmas present to my children who are multiracial. They're in their 20s, but I gave it to them for Christmas anyway. And they really appreciated it and loved it because they understand that, there are different ways of being multiracial, and it depends on your family culture, your particular parents, how much do they teach you, how much they don't teach you. And then, like there's one scene where the cousins, I think it's the cousins very naturally ask for chopsticks. Like, can we have chopsticks? And the younger cousin it had never occurred to her to use chopsticks. And the mom says, oh, of course we have chopsticks. Here you go. And she's like, we have chopsticks? So they were there all along, but it had never occurred to her to use them or to learn how to use them. Then the older cousins teach her how to use them. It's beautiful and delightful. And it's okay that some multiracial people don't use chopsticks. And, it's just, so that was one of the things I appreciate. And also in terms of the current conversation about race in our country, sometimes it can be very reductive. Like, you are this race and you are this way, and you are this race and you are this way. And it's really not like that at all. And without talking about it specifically, I think this book hints at that complexity a lot. Mm-hmm.
I absolutely agree. I was really struck by that element of the book, and just, and all the things are there, right? And Katie Yamasaki's like, she's not being super, right? She doesn't have to explain it, right? It's just like, there are multiracial people who have big multiracial families, and this is just a normal part of life. This isn't like this special book that's really about this topic, right? And also, that too, that kind of difference. There are kind of like lots of like axes of difference, right? And race is one of them that's present in the book, but it's not the only one. So there's so much complexity, and it's just, I felt that it just really normalized that kind of feeling of like, oh, I don't really know what to do with this person, and just kind of leaves that open. And one of the things that I really appreciated about it actually was, I think it was very realistic in that right. Everybody kind of needed time. Everybody kind of needed time and space to really acclimate to each other. And I think the ending was really nice, that it was a note from the cousins who maybe couldn't, say at first, like, wow, your bicycle is really cool, or wow, like we've never seen fireflies like this before. This is amazing, right? Because they're still kind of taking it in. But once they had the time and the space to process it, they were able to write this very lovely note, and just like, these are the things that we appreciate about you.
Yeah, and I think cousins are special too in terms of relationships, because you might not. I have a big family. My mom's the oldest of 7 siblings, and my grandmother is one of 9 siblings. So I have a lot of cousins and a lot of cousin aunties. And one of the thing about about cousins is that you might not see them very often. You might see them once a year or once every few years, whenever there's a family reunion, but you always hear about them. So you know about them all the time as you're growing up. So you know a lot more about them than, say, another person that you might meet the same amount of times. Does that make sense? Because your mom is always telling you stories and you always get the updates. And so now as adults with my cousins, and so this is kind of also what I see in the book, because I'm thinking forward into the future based on my experience. So now my cousins and I, we're all adults, but we kind of check in with each other. It's like, so, how are things going on your side? What's going on with your mom? And because we already know the stories, but we want to hear it from the other point of view. And that's really great. My latest thing is I'm organizing a lot of Zoom calls for my mom and my aunties, because they have become an expert, unfortunately. Yeah. So
I think maybe we should move to Fish for Jimmy, which if I remember correctly, this was actually the earliest of these three books. Mm-hmm. So we actually discussed them in backwards chronological order in terms of their publication. Right?
Which is lovely, actually. It's sort of lovely.
And yeah, this book was really touching. And just like so much story and emotional resonance just kind of like packed into a very few pages. And I wasn't even sure at first when I read it that right. So it begins with the parents listening to the radio and hearing that Pearl Harbor has been bombed. And then saying, the FBI came and arrested my dad. And I was like, is this the same day? Is this later? What is this? And I was kind of surprised and horrified. And of course, this was just me not knowing my history too. At the end, when I realized, yes, it was that very same day. So I guess I'd just like to open up for discussion. I don't have a particular question, but I would really love to hear everybody's thoughts about, right. So this is one of the kind of most, there's many to choose from, but this is kind of one of the most horrifying episodes that happened in U.S. history in terms of the federal government carrying out a certain kind of violence and injustice. And in fact, that it was not even a century ago is that's, but I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on just the framing of this incident, which I'm so glad I'm so glad that this book is in the McGraw-Hill Reader now. So kids know this story. But what did you all think of the way that she took this historical incident and this family story and made it into this story for children? What did you think about her approach to that?
I think one thing that really struck me about this book is that, the one of the central things is that Jimmy stops eating when they go to this internment camp. And there's he's in this situation, which is horrifying, and but he's also just a kid. So I think about how kids deal with change on a small scale and a big scale, and not eating is there's a lot of kids who would have something disrupted in their schedule and maybe stop eating. So it's really struck me that it's there's this monumental, huge change going on in our country. That's a horrifying chapter, as you said, Emily, of our history. And his family is feeling worried about that. And they have all that to deal with. His mother is also ashamed that he's not eating, but he's also just doing this kid thing. He's just a kid, and all he knows is his world has changed in a terrifying way. And so I just thought it was a really interesting way to tell that story, like to relay how big it was and how horrible it was, but also from a child's reaction, like how's a child going to handle that? You know, they might just do something that kids do for any number of reasons, which is like, this is not food I'm used to. This isn't what I know. So I can't cope. I thought that was just an interesting framework and probably makes it relatable to, you know, to kids reading it for sure.
You also have the dynamic of the two brothers sort of having to take care of each other, but also worry about their mom because the dad is gone. So the three members of the family that are present in the bulk of the book is they're all going through their own thing, but they have to help each other cope. And when the older brother ends up getting the fish and bringing them to Jimmy, he said, are these Pacific fish? Do they come from far away like us? Like he just knew that he was different in that respect. And that's how he had this attachment to the fish and like the representation of that. And I love the way the fish, the way they were illustrated across the page. And you'd mentioned how Jimmy was lying on the backs of those fish. Like that image, when it just came up upon that spread in the book, I just paused and just stared at and I could just see the flow. And I love that just him curled up sleeping on those fish as his protection, you know? But anyway, so having the three different family members and what they were going through. So you have the older brother who was going through his own trauma, but then also having to manage his brother, and then his brother being sad, and his mom is also not smiling. So finally getting the brother to eat something, the mom smiles. So it's sort of like this family affair of like helping each other, but also recognizing like that I'm not okay myself. So.
I noticed reading the three books, I read that first. I think I read them in chronological order, actually, unintentionally. But so that one I felt had a really dark palette to it, which kind of like was more appropriate for the subject matter it was dealing with. It was more muted tones. And then really the only color was when, in the beginning, when it's showing their market where they sell fruits and vegetables and stuff, which, talking back to Lucy's subject about like how food was so important this whole time, and their life centered around food. Before this, they had a marketplace. So yeah, just the palette changing throughout that. And then when he goes into the forest, it's a different palette. It's more like rich and has some greens and stuff in there, but it's still kind of muted. But then the fish are this bright yellow. So the fish, it's like a visually important aspect of the book too, which I thought was interesting. Everything Naomi Loved is super bright throughout the whole thing. So I thought that was like a really striking contrast, was the way she approached color throughout the three books.
I was really struck that this was based on a true story. I read that in the end note from Katie. And I guess when I was reading it, it seemed a little, I thought it was beautiful, but it almost seemed like fantastical to me, because I was like, I was kind of like, well, this is like a lovely message, but like no way could like a fairly young boy like sneak out repeatedly to like catch fish. But I think realizing that it was true just made me, I read it again after I found that out at the end, because I kind of, it changed my perception of the story itself, that this is like basically based on real characters in a real story. I just found that to be just absolutely amazing, and really kind of drove the whole story home for me, and made it real for me, because it is. So that was what was just so interesting to me.
Yeah, fishing was a thing that people would sneak out of camps, because we remember these concentration camps, right? They're wrapped in barbed wire. There's guards and sentry towers with the guns pointed in, not out. But there are stories. There's a documentary called Manzanar Fishing Club about how people would sometimes sneak out at night and go fishing, any way to get a little, just to get out. And I think they're mostly, young people who are just trying to, so it did happen. And when I heard the story, I knew the historical reference. So I knew this isn't just an isolated story. This happened, people did sneak out to go fishing. And yeah. And also there's a project, I think at UCLA, about ways that people resisted the being the incarceration. And one of the ways, because again, right, there's like, well, actually, this is what we were talking about at the beginning. There isn't just one way to resist, right? It's not just standing there with a bullhorn protesting. But one of the ways that people resisted the incarceration, one, by joining the military, right? By volunteering to fight to prove how American they were. But there was also a group of people who resisted by not volunteering, by saying, we're happy to fight in your army, but you gotta let our parents out of jail first. And so by not joining the army, they were also resisting. But one of the groups that they do talk about in terms of resistance was sneaking out to go fishing at night. That was a way to resist as well.
I'm really struck by just all of her work and how real it feels in terms of just like a child's experience, which we kind of already talked about. Like, there's all this other stuff going on and it's obviously very traumatic, but he's just like living his kid life, focused on fish, focused on his little brother. He kind of mentions other kids playing. I don't remember where I heard this, but there was a podcast that I listened to about a group of Girl Scouts who, Japanese American Girl Scouts who, then in their internment camp kind of treated the whole thing kind of like a long extended Girl Scout trip where they, still practiced their tying their knots and they did cleanups and they like worked to make the camp look really nice. And they just the resilience that is present in kids when they're faced with these really tough circumstances and just how they respond. And I feel like there's so much space in this book for just thinking about how you might respond and how just like the relationship with the brother and protecting your family and just really how kids were able to get through all of this.
Yeah, scouting is really important for the Japanese American community to this day. And I think a lot of that started during that period. And one of the things Katie says, she did an exhibition of the art from this book in New York a few years ago. And she said that the last scene in the book is of the boys looking out. So they're looking out through the barbed wire fence at the outside together. And she says, from her, obviously she's never seen that view before, but during the exhibition, a woman who's Syrian, who'd grown up in a refugee camp, came up to her and said, I know that look, right? I know that view and that look in their eyes. And so she said that was sad, but also gratifying that she had gotten it in a way that other people can resonate. Because I think the story is not just about the incarceration. It's not just about one family story, right? It resonates across other situations. And it's beautiful that other people are able to see those connections as well.
I thought it was so nice to have a specific story told about this. I had grown up hearing about this as a kid, but it was very abstract. Mm-hmm. And by telling one very specific story, I think brings a lot of details home and makes it much more, realistic, or you're able to really put yourself in someone else's position much better.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that McGraw-Hill is licensing it, or whatever, Francis, you said, to teach the fourth graders, because I think that's it's an accessible story, but also a really powerful story that I think will help young people kind of start to think about this, as you said, Emily, like horrific time in American history. And it's a really powerful and I think good way of starting to teach that. So that was really cool to learn that the fourth graders will be reading that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in fourth grade, they're old enough, right? They're smart enough to make connections to whatever's happening in the present day. And so right now we have a lot of anti-Asian American violence. It's I like to call COVID-inspired anti-Asian American violence, and it's unjustified, and it's violent, and it's horrific, and there's there's all sorts of stuff going on, and to the extent that, and certainly Asian American kids are talking about it. fourth graders are talking about it in their homes. They're worried about their grandparents. They're worried about their parents, and not just from COVID, but also worried about people going out, right? Statistically, I think elders and women are being disproportionately targeted in these attacks. And parents are also not letting their kids go back to school because they're afraid their children will be bullied in school. And so Asian American kids get this, but also I think other kids will see and make these connections as well to the current day. I mean, when it came out, there were different issues, but there are different horrible issues, but unfortunately, this is something that keeps coming back.
Mm-hmm. And I think similar to something you were saying at the very beginning, Frances, about, how children live through gentrification, right? And also just how children lived through, in the internment camps. I appreciate the way that all of these books, they kind of hinge, right? Because they provide comfort to children who are going through that experience, and they're normalizing it and saying, yes, you are right to be sad. Yes, you are right. You are struggling, and that is normal. But it also gives people who do not share that experience a window into that experience. And I think that's just something that's really lovely about this book, is that it can serve both of those communities at the same time. Right. And it's and I think that the theme that I'm seeing through these books, right, whether implicit or explicit, is just sharing our perspectives and coming together and trying to understand one another. And I think that that's just something that her work just carries out very well. Okay, well, I think this is a good place to wrap up our discussion. So I want to thank everybody for this discussion today. Thank you so much, Frances, for introducing us to these books and giving us some additional rich story about Katie Yamasaki and her work. And thank you everyone for participating in the discussion. And all three of these books are available for checkout at the Ann Arbor District Library. So,
yay. And thank you very much for having me and letting me talk about all this and share my enthusiasm for Katie Yamasaki. I love her work. If you want to find more information about her website is katieyamasaki.com. And I've written 2 articles about her, one for NBC News and one for Our Detroit. And I'll send you the URL so you can post them at the end. But she's great. Go get her books.